So this is one of my favorite ideas I've ever had. I call it the physics of meaning. It's an idea that came to me, and then when I researched it, realized that there are actually a couple other people that had the exact same thing, or had the exact same idea, which annoyed me at the time, but now I think it's great. It means there's other people who came to the same conclusion as I did, looking at the same body of work, and that there's other people studying it, probably definitely to greater capacity than I'm able to do. So the physics of meaning, not the meaning of physics. I don't know much about physics. I just know incredibly the basic. I know the basics. So first, you have to understand embodied cognition. The idea that our ideas, the way we think abstractly, we derive that from experiences we have with our body. And we often do it metaphorically. For instance, we talk about truth as if it's relational to nakedness. Because we're a body and we put clothes on when we go outside, and then we strip those clothes off in our more intimate moments. And so we have this experience, and then we use that to talk about this very abstract idea of truth, which is that for most things, there are layers on top that are disguising it, and that you have to strip away those layers to get at the underlying truth, the naked truth, right? So if you take this idea to be true, the first thing I thought of is that when you think about if meaning does derive from the body, and the body is set in the world of physics, then that the world of physics should tell us an extraordinary amount about how we construct meaning. Specifically, how we talk about causality. How we negotiate blame, how we talk about free will, how we talk about intention. All of these large philosophical issues are bound up in the fact that we are bodies that are susceptible to the laws of physics. So let me give you an example. So applied force. Applied force is when you push or pull something, such as these glasses. I could push my glasses, they could fall in the tub, right? Pretty simple. You could say, in that action, that I pushed my glasses in the tub, or I pushed my glasses, that I intended for them to fall in the tub, and that I'm then responsible, let's say, if they break. Right, that's a pretty straightforward idea. But it gets very complicated very quickly when we start using those forces abstractly. For instance, just think about how we use pushing and pulling to talk about relationships. All right, let's say two people just start dating and they're not quite sure what their relationship is. And, let's say the girlfriend is talking to one of her friends and she's like, yeah, I really like this guy. I feel like I might be pushing a little too hard though. And her girlfriend says something like, oh, I don't think you're pushing hard enough. You really need to push him harder. That's all immediately understandable. You don't have to know about embodied cognition. You don't have to know about any of this for that to immediately make sense. But I think it's worth taking it apart and looking at it more slowly, just to see how complex of an idea that we're talking about here. So in that brief exchange, you have two people, the boyfriend and the girlfriend. Or I guess just two people who are sleeping together. And then there is an imagined future destination that is a relationship. It's essentially an abstracted, bounded space, like a circle, right? And you're trying to push that person into that circle, right? Because that is some kind of definitive conceptualization that, you could take to mean whatever you want it to mean. But it's a relationship. And that's in the future. So you are not just doing this in physical space, you are doing this linearly on a timeline in which, as you are walking, you are moving forward. Because when we move forward, we go into the future. We move behind, we go into the past. So you're walking along with this person, and you're trying to push them into this future goal that you see. And we talk this way because we are trying to understand causation, right? We're trying to understand why, in this case, the man doesn't want to go to this place that he is being pushed. And of course, you could think about it the other way. And so you could imagine these two women, after the relationship has ended, just being like, I pushed him too hard, And what that means is you're accepting the blame. You're accepting some kind of causal blame for your actions. So I'll give you another example. You could think about okay. So let's just keep going with this one. To make it even more complicated, so not only do you have forces, external forces pushing and pulling on you, right? You have the girlfriend pushing on the boyfriend. Maybe you have the boyfriend's friends pushing on him. Maybe you have his attraction to someone else pulling him in another direction. So you have an incredibly complex equation of forces interacting externally. But then you have internal forces too, right? You've got I'm just not pushing myself hard enough, right? Which is incredibly strange in the world of physics, in that an object cannot push itself. And this is one of the interesting distinctions between the meaning of physics and the physics of meaning, which is that in the physics of meaning, objects can push themselves. They can create momentum for themselves, or at least that's how we conceive that works. You can push yourself. You can push yourself too hard. You cannot push yourself hard enough, right? And so you have kind of these mysterious internal forces that we talk about as if we don't really have a whole lot of control over them. But we do. But when people, we do in a way, or we talk about them. And I guess this is a good point to say that I'm actually not really interested in, at least when I talk about things in this fashion, the actual reality of the situation. What interests me is how people talk about it, how we think it works. And it is an interesting side discussion to think about maybe the failures in terms of how we think our meaningful reality works and how it actually works. That is interesting, but that's just like a whole other topic to get into. So when something happens in the world, a lot of the discussion around it is about causation and who's to blame. When there's another school shooting, for instance, most of the analysis that I read and most of the online fighting is essentially about someone picking a single issue that they think is incredibly important and saying that this one causal variable is the one to pay attention to and is the most responsible, right? It has the greatest force in the world. And whether you think that's the availability of guns or mental health or cultural influences that makes people lash out in this random violent fashion, right? You're giving those a certain force, and that force is typically greater than the person's internal force, and that the internal force is essentially what we talk about as will, right? The ability to overcome external forces. And so this is, there's of course a long-ranging debate over free will, whether it exists, to what extent it exists. And I guess my contribution would be to say that that whole debate revolves around us stuck in this frame of thinking about causation in the world of physics, of thinking about our ability to resist forces in this very particular way that may not be a good description of how things actually work. And so we may just be in this language trap that's impossible to get out of. One thing I will say, and I had a bit of this discussion online, is what I think the importance of the difference between will and free will. I mean, just linguistically, I don't think there's anything you get from adding the word free on to will except more conceptual confusion. Because will is a perfectly good term. And the way we use it in the sense I've been talking about. There are external forces that are being exerted on us, and our will is our ability to resist the external forces. I really think philosophy could be helped along by, in the debate for definitions, to have a good understanding of cognitive linguistics and really take a look at how the everyday person talks about these issues and use that, and that should play some role of importance in trying to define these large abstract concepts, because language develops from the bottom up. It's not a top-down system. You can't define words and then try to get people to use them in the way exactly how you want them to be used. And so I lost my place. Language is a top-down system. Language is a bottom-up system. Right. So it's important. We are a hypersocial organism, and language emerged from that system of trying to come up with a greater degree of social organization. And one of the major issues in doing that is how to negotiate blame. And this is how we've done it, by borrowing from the world of physics. Now, applied force, again, we use that to really highlight intentionality, whether people meant to do things or not. If somebody pushed somebody to do something, then they share in the responsibility for that action. But that's just one force, right? There's so many other forces in physics. And there are external forces, such as gravity, that we don't have the same kind of causal connection to. Right? Gravity is a force that is applied to everyone equally, and it is under no one's control. And it has to do with the largeness or smallness of the mass of an object. I'm actually not, again, this is where I know almost barely enough about physics to get me in trouble. But the meaningful way we talk about it, when things are big, when it's a big deal, right? That event in our lives, let's say someone we love dies, right? That's a big deal. And because it's a big deal and not something small, that big object exerts a force on us, a gravitational pull. And we are less likely to hold people responsible for their actions when we conceive of things this way. Like if somebody gets broken up with and kind of goes through a manic couple months of lashing out in ways they normally don't do, I think we generally kind of there's a time frame in which we give people where we maybe are more accepting of that type of behavior. And then everybody has their own line of, well, you need to get over it and get on with your life. But again, a breakup we think of as a big deal, and that the bigness of it exerts a force that has a pull on our trajectory. The word gravity was originally a metaphor. A grave situation. Things that had gravity were weighty things, which meant seriousness. So here we have the underlying metaphor that seriousness is weight. And the heavier something is, the more serious it is. And we think about this in another physical way, which is that we think about carrying a burden, right? And that burden is lighter or heavier. And the heavier a burden is, the harder it is to move along your journey because you're carrying so much weight and it's weighing you down, right? All these expressions come from this basic idea. A big event happens to you. You take that big event and you hold it, and that becomes part of your burden that you then carry, which weighs you down. It's worth saying that all of these metaphoric systems, they're all semi-coherent. And I could do this kind of like associative slide forever, linking one system to the next system, to the next system, to the next system. They're almost like daisy chained in a way. But that doesn't mean they're entirely coherent or 100% rational systems. There's holes in every single metaphor. So this is another important lesson I think philosophy could take into account, which is that when you're describing things in a frame, a metaphoric frame in language, you will always find a rational hole in that system. That doesn't mean that particular frame is bad or wrong. That's just the basic nature of meaning and what we're using to try to describe reality. It's not like math. Language isn't like math, where it just builds on itself in this perfect way. It's just not. Oh, got off track. So then Isaac Newton came up with his theory of gravity and took the word gravity from the metaphor being weighty and serious. So I always thought that was interesting, that the metaphor came before the physical law. And so the reason I think this is important is we use this type of language to negotiate some of our most serious interactions that we have. When we are in the throes of a fight with someone we love, we are negotiating our lives. These are the building blocks that we're using. And so I think, I don't have any evidence that it makes someone a better arguer or communicator to understand the building blocks of meaning, but I can't see how it would hurt. Do I have anything else to say about gravity? Yes. So lots of slang. You see lots of slang is metaphoric. They're just plays off of a very old metaphoric system. I mean, you can think about heat as desire, right? Right now, people are saying things are lit. That's going to go on for maybe another year. Before, I remember people saying that things were on fire, which sounds really stupid now. Things are hot. Hot's been around for a long time. And so we're just constantly playing with coming up with new ways to describe a different aspect of the conceptual system. One example of that is in social media, there's this new term called orbiting, right, where somebody stays in another person's consciousness by liking their posts and maybe commenting every once in a while and viewing certain things. And so this person the idea is the person is essentially just orbiting far away, but within some sort of distance to be relational. All right, so that's a way in which technology has come together, and we've just played off of the idea of gravity in a novel way. And we're going to do this forever. Other forces of physics. So we've got magnetism. Magnetism, very similar to gravity in that it is an outside force that is exerted on us. And so we use magnetism to talk about things that have an effect on us in the world that we don't feel as if we have control over. One of the main ones is our attraction, right? What are we drawn to? What are we attracted to? What pulls us to them? So one, obvious lesson from looking at the language of how we talk about this is that people don't really seem to think they have much control over their own attraction, which they probably don't. So here's kind of like a weaselly way that people use this to try to get out of responsibility, or try to throw off kind of the causal narrative. Like, let's say you have a couple, they're in a relationship, and then the woman is attracted to another man and ends up sleeping with them and destroys a relationship. And the couple gets back together and tries to sort out what's happened, right? And so from the woman might say something like, I don't know what came over me. It was just like there was this intense attraction and it just pulled me in, and I just felt like I had no control. Like I should have been able to control myself. I should have been able to resist, but I just couldn't help it. And the guy might say something like, you had perfect control over what you were doing. You knew how it would hurt me, and you did it anyway. Right? You drew him in, or something like that. Right? And so the argument here is essentially the woman trying to frame causation externally by forces being exerted on her, and the man trying to frame it internally as if, again, with applied force, that she kind of pushed this to happen. And I don't know how you resolve that. You could argue about that forever, trying to think of what actually caused that situation to happen. It's incredibly complex. Think about all the variables that could be in play. That is a complex physics problem. Electricity goes along with magnetism, electromagnetic force. Pretty much the same thing. Well, no. So we talk about magnetic attraction, and we talk about what is the difference between that and the way we talk about electricity in people coming together. I mean, we don't really talk about electricity pulling us together, even though that's, if you've ever touched a really hot wire, it's actually hard to pull your hand away. Electricity does have a pull, but we don't really talk about it that way. we talk about electricity sparking things, kind of energizing. And this, again, this is an interesting note in terms of technological innovation and how it changes language. It gives us a new way to talk about this very old thing, right? Nobody's talking about that kind of like, electricity you might feel with another person in the 1700s. But they had other ways, like you can talk about desire as fire, right? You can talk about somebody kindling a love that you hold with a spark. Like all of those things are available to people early on. And so just as technology, as it advances, it gives us new means to frame these old ideas. And I'll probably give a lecture just around that idea, the ways technology can shape language. Electricity is not a very complicated one. Possibly because it's a much newer one, right? Like we haven't had as much time to be with electricity. And also we don't really experience it much in our everyday life, right? Like, it's all around us, but we don't actually see electricity arc, across a circuit or shock us or set things on, you know what I mean? Any of those kind of things are really absent from our daily experience. A more, like you can even think about something like wind resistance. If somebody describes a person as a drag, just kind of, I think that's a slang that happened maybe in the 60s or 70s. Oh man, what a drag. Which I guess a person can be a drag and an event can be a drag. And it's essentially talking about wind resistance, right? It's like, let's say you have an object flying through the air, right? And it's headed towards a location, which in this case is probably fun. And you add something onto that object, let's say a person, and they are a drag, right? And they create more wind resistance. And so your object doesn't go as fast and it falls short of your goal, right? Of the trajectory, because it increased the drag on the object. Anyway, this is just another way in which slang is so influenced by the world of physics. I guess I'll end this with talking a little bit more about will and how central I think this is to that discussion. Again, I would really define will as the ability to resist forces. And I would define it, again, differently than free will, because will is not free from anything. Will is bound up with all of these external forces and internal forces being exerted on it. Will is itself an external force, but the way we talk about it is as there's other internal forces that you also have to resist. So it's inextricably bound with all of those. So it's not free from any of that. And really its only power is to be able to resist some of the forces. It's not, I don't think we talk about it like, well, you can choose path A or path B. And that choice, we do talk about, but we use a different metaphor to talk about different paths and different choices. And being responsible for going down one path as opposed to another path. But in terms of causation, you resist these forces. And here's the compounded understanding of it. You are an upright person, right? Strong spine. You stand upright to resist, and if you strengthen yourself through any number of practices, whether spiritual, moral, communal, whatever, you gain a greater ability to resist all of these forces, and you can remain upright in the face of something pushing on you from all directions. Now, if you don't do this, if you have a weak spine, right, if you are an immoral person, these forces push you around at their will, and you end up falling down, and you are on the ground. And the ground is low down. It's dirty, right? It's where you go to die. We associate the ground with a lot of bad things: death, sickness, just generally being bad. We think about up as being good, down as being bad. I'm feeling down today. Now I'm feeling up, right? Synonymous. And so we use this. Let me see if I can extrapolate the whole compounded metaphor. You are walking, your life is a journey, point A to point B. You are walking along a timeline in which the future is ahead of you. There are external forces that are pushing you and internal forces that are pushing and pulling on you as you're on this path. If you remain an upright person, moral person, you will continue on the path. If you don't, you will be blown off the path. You will meet another person. All these people will have various effects on you that are out of either of your control. They can magnetically pull you in. There can be sparks that fly, that can ignite things, like passion. That's a fire that burns, that can, destroy or be used for something useful. And as we're moving along through this journey with all of these other people and all of these things are happening, we are trying to understand how the moves that we are making in this system have any sort of effect on what's happening going forward. And so that's when we sit down in front of someone we love or someone we hate, and we're having this intense discussion about all of these things. Just keep in mind, one, I guess, how complicated this is. It's incredible to me, I guess, that we think that we have any hope of ever figuring any of this stuff out. And two, that we've just intuitively come up with this semi-coherent metaphoric system in which we can negotiate blame and causation and intentionality through the laws of physics. Just, on our own. And you don't have to understand anything of what I just said. You could be completely ignorant of all this, and you could operate in those systems flawlessly.